Welcome to the 2020 Brewtubers Online Brewers Club Yeast Experiment. Brought to you by our proud sponsors. Woody's Homebrew Store. Use code BREWTUBERS for 10% off your entire order and get free shipping on any order over $58. Go to www.woodysHomebrew.com. Imperial Yeast, a half stainless steel mash panel sponsor of the Brewtubers Online Brewers Club and official yeast provider of the Yeast Experiment. Imperial Yeast offers brewers of all sizes access to world-class yeast and the best possible customer and technical support. Be sure to grab a pack or two now at your local homebrew shop or Woody's Homebrew. And lastly, Hopsteiner, the official hops provider of the 2020 Yeast Experiment. Get brewing.
What's up, guys? This is Jerry from AdventuresInHomebrewing.Beer, and I am getting myself ready for the Brewtubers Yeast Experiment 2020. So right now I'm going to be making a yeast starter, so we'll have a little bit of that. But I just wanted to talk about one of my little homebrew hacks that I do, and that involves this thing right here. No, it is not for hops. What I do is when I'm getting my pot ready, what I do is I take this, I open it up, put it down there, so then that way when I fill up my Erlenmeyer flask and put it in there while the water's boiling, the water can go all the way around the bottom and it doesn't bounce and make all sorts of noise and drive my wife crazy. So let's get this thing running and let's make a yeast starter. So one of the important things that you got to think about when you're making a yeast starter is that you've got some dried malt extract around for it. It's also really important to have a scale. So I've gone through and I've tarred out my scale to take off the weight of the bowl, because you want to make sure that you have the right ratio of dried malt extract to water. I'm making a 2-liter starter, so I am going to need 200 grams of this to go in there to do a little boiling up before I make my starter. And for my starter today, we are going to be in this experiment using some Berserker yeast. Yes, that's right. Olaf Berserker. Some of you might get that reference. This is from Maniacal Yeast. It is a Kvike blend, and this is what I'm going to be using in the yeast experiment. And so we're going to get this ready to rock and roll. Another thing to think about when you're making your yeast starter is make sure that you've got some yeast nutrient, because it likes that for when it's growing. Super important to keep that yeast healthy, especially when you're using the Kvike yeast, because it needs that extra nutrients to go kind of crazy in there. So don't forget your yeast nutrient. So my slurry's all set. It's got some dried malt extract in there. It's got some yeast nutrient in there. So let's put her in. So I talked about that homebrew hack. I put it so basically you can see it sits just to the side. It's a little bit on an angle, but it is enough that it stops it from bouncing and making all sorts of noise. So we're going to let this get up to a boil. We'll get the boil going. We're going to cool it down with the Kvike yeast. I'm going to have it at about 90 degrees when I pitch the yeast for the starter, so it'll have that nice temperature that it really likes. And we're going to let it fly. So another thing that you want to have on hand when you are making a yeast starter is one of these, because then I can grab my flask right out of there, give it a little swirl to kind of get things mixed up a little bit, get the broth moving a little bit, and put it back in and not worry about it. Also realize, I've got the boil. That's right. You don't hear this thing bouncing. That's a great thing. Just one more quick thing that I do, this nice little stir bar that you need for when you're making your yeast starter. After my flask has been boiling a little bit here, I just drop that right in there, so that way it kind of gets sanitized in the heat, and that's just a way that I know that it's in good shape for when it's growing the yeast, and it's not going to bring in anything bad. The last step that I do on getting my starter ready to pitch some yeast is I want to get it down to temp. I want to get it down to temp fast, and so I take some ice, toss it in some fresh water, and we make sure that there's a bit of water there. Swirl it a little bit along the way, to help kind of move the liquid around a little bit, and that way it'll get it down to my pitching temps for me, because you don't want to pitch your yeast when it's too hot. So my final step is going to be pitching a little dab of the Berserker yeast into my yeast starter. I cooled that down to pitching temps. So let's go ahead and give that a little bit of yeast. Now the nice thing about Kveik is you don't need a ton in there, so you can see I don't have a ton of yeast in there, but it'll make a nice starter. And I'm overbuilding my starter due to the fact that I want to have some extras for next time. And so I will keep some of it in a jar. I'll probably dry some of it along the way, and I will also use some of the starter directly for this yeast experiment batch. So we've got that spinning, and the last step is to, I just sprayed this down with a little star sand. So then I'm going to just take that and cover the top. Kind of loose, it'll stop any of the nasties from getting in there with the star sand. That's good, and you can see we're already starting to spin. And so that'll work its way through. And we'll have our yeast for the yeast experiment for Brewtubers 2020 yeast experiment. And then we'll get to brew with it. So we'll see you next time.